John Roberts thought he could shut Jasmine Crockett down by cutting her off again and again, talking over her like her voice didn't matter. But when she finally fired back with one cold, data-backed sentence, the entire Supreme Court chamber froze. The Chief Justice was left speechless. Cameras caught the moment in real time, and the shocking fallout exploded across the nation as the audience realized they had just witnessed a power shift no one saw coming. John Roberts walked into the chamber carrying the weight of the court on his shoulders. For years, he had built his reputation on control, restraint, and protecting the Supreme Court's image. To him, legitimacy wasn't just a concept, it was power. On voting rights, that pressure was even heavier. The Shelby County decision still followed him like a shadow, praised by supporters as constitutional discipline, and condemned by critics as the spark that weakened federal protections. Roberts believed he was defending the institution, but he also knew this hearing could reopen old wounds. Jasmine Crockett walked into the chamber with a very different mindset. She came from where losing meant real people couldn't vote, where rules weren't theoretical but personal. As a civil rights attorney turned lawmaker, she had learned to fight systems that didn't want to be challenged. She understood the unwritten rules of powerful rooms. Stay polite, stay narrow, don't make waves, and she made a choice not to follow them. To her, this wasn't about protecting the court's image. It was about forcing the truth into the open. The stakes made the tension even sharper. Elections were approaching. States were rolling out new voting restrictions. Congress was pushing a bill that could either restore federal oversight or die under legal pressure. Behind the formal language and black robes was a real power struggle. Who gets to shape the rules of democracy? Roberts was guarding the institution. Crockett was pushing to change it, and the moment she stepped up to the podium, it was clear this wasn't going to be a quiet hearing. It was the collision of two worlds, control versus confrontation, and only one of them was about to walk away unchanged. Crockett had barely finished saying, "Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice," when Roberts cut in. "Let's skip the storytelling and get to constitutional law," he snapped, not even looking up from his notes. The interruption landed like a slap. A few people in the gallery straightened in their seats. Crockett paused, met his eyes, and replied calmly, "With respect, sir, voters are not stories. They are the reason constitutional law exists." She tried again, tightening her phrasing, moving straight into the legal foundation. 30 seconds later, Roberts jumped in again, louder this time. "We are not here to hear campaign speeches." That line drew visible reactions. A reporter's eyebrows shot up. Someone in the back let out a quiet scoff. Crockett inhaled slowly and said, "Calling documented harm campaign talk doesn't make it disappear, it just makes it inconvenient." The room began to buzz with tension, the kind that tells everyone something bigger is building. The third interruption hit harder and sharper. Roberts leaned forward, voice cutting through the chamber. "Congresswoman, answer the court's questions instead of performing for the cameras." That accusation changed the tone instantly. Crockett's expression tightened. "I didn't come here to perform," she fired back, still controlled but no longer passive. "I came here to present evidence. You keep refusing to let me finish." A few justices looked up at the same time. Kagan stopped writing. Jackson folded her hands and watched closely. The fourth interruption followed almost immediately, Roberts stepping in again before Crockett could finish her sentence. "You're drifting off topic," he said coldly. Crockett didn't step back. "No, sir," she replied. "I'm getting too close to the part you don't want on the record." A low murmur rolled through the gallery. People leaned forward. This wasn't routine anymore. This was turning personal. By the fifth interruption, Roberts dropped the polite framing altogether. "Stick to precedent," he ordered, voice firm and dismissive like he was shutting a door. That's when the room reacted out loud. You could hear whispers ripple across the benches. Someone audibly exhaled in disbelief. Crockett stiffened, gripping the podium. "Precedent didn't stand in line for 6 hours to vote," she said sharply. "Precedent didn't get purged from voter rolls. Real people did. And every time you cut me off, you're proving exactly why this law exists." The temperature in the chamber spiked. Even the court staff looked unsettled. Behind her, Crockett's team locked in. One aide subtly shifted forward. Another lifted the folder they had prepared, fingers tightening around its edge. Crockett stopped speaking. She didn't apologize. She didn't soften her tone. She just stood there, staring straight ahead, letting the weight of the last interruption hang in the air. The room went unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavier than noise. Crockett finally broke the silence. She lifted her head slowly and spoke before Roberts could interrupt again. "Mr. Chief Justice," she said, her voice calm but cutting. "Before you stop me for the 6th time, I want to put something on the record that this room has been pretending not to see." A low murmur rippled through the gallery. "I have transcripts from your last 20 oral arguments, not opinions, not rumors, transcripts." Roberts's eyes narrowed. "Those records show that female advocates in this courtroom are interrupted nearly 3 times more often than male advocates. And today, in real time, you just added another example." His hand shot up instinctively, ready to cut her off again, and then froze midair. Crockett didn't slow down. You didn't interrupt me because I was unclear. You interrupted me because I was getting close to evidence you didn't want dominating the room. The chamber locked up. Roberts's fingers hovered in the air, stiff, uncertain, like his body had betrayed him before his authority could react. Justice Kagan leaned forward sharply. Justice Jackson's pen stopped moving. Alito whispered something under his breath to Gorsuch, but even that sounded loud in the sudden silence. Crockett pressed harder. This is exactly how voter suppression works, she said. Not with chains and closed doors anymore, but with control, with interruptions, with cutting people off before they finish their case. You don't ban the voice, you drown it. A reporter in the gallery lowered her notebook slowly, eyes wide. The air felt tight, like the room itself was holding its breath. Crockett raised a single sheet of paper. This data was verified by 3 independent academic institutions. It tracks speaking time, interruption frequency, and topic targeting, and here's what it shows. When the subject is civil rights, voting access, or minority impact, the interruptions spike. Roberts finally lowered his hand, but his jaw tightened. You keep telling me to stick to precedent, Crockett continued, voice firm, but precedent doesn't get silenced mid-sentence, people do, and today you've been doing it in front of the entire country. A few audible gasps slipped out in the gallery before people caught themselves. This wasn't normal Supreme Court tension. This was confrontation. She turned slightly and nodded. Her aide immediately stood and began distributing thick folders to court staff who carried them down the line of justices. Every one of you has a copy, Crockett said. Page numbers, timestamps, patterns highlighted. This isn't personal, it's structural, and that makes it more dangerous. Roberts looked down as the folder landed in front of him. He flipped the cover open, eyes scanning fast. The color drained slightly from his face. Crockett didn't wait. This isn't about me standing here, she said. It's about who never gets to stand here long enough to finish a sentence. It's about voices erased quietly, politely, professionally, so nobody has to admit it's happening. She leaned forward just enough to make the point sting. You call this courtroom neutral, but neutrality doesn't look like cutting one side off 5 times in a row. That looks like control. The silence became heavy, uncomfortable, almost hostile. Even the court officers along the wall stood frozen. Crockett straightened. And that is why this voting rights law exists, because suppression today doesn't always come with shouting. Sometimes it comes with robes, procedure, and a raised hand that never lets the sentence finish. Robert slowly lifted his eyes from the folder and looked back at her. He didn't interrupt, he didn't speak, he just stared. Roberts finally cleared his throat, and the sound alone broke the tension like a crack of ice. When he spoke again, his voice was different. Slower, tighter, more controlled, no longer carrying the easy authority he'd used earlier. Representative Crockett, he said, choosing his words carefully, you've raised a serious claim about courtroom conduct. He glanced down at the folder in front of him, then back up. While I dispute the idea of intent, I cannot dismiss the data you've presented. That sentence alone sent a ripple through the gallery. Crockett didn't move, she waited. Robert shifted in his chair, visibly aware of every camera in the room. This court values evidence-based arguments, he continued, more restrained now. You will have the remainder of your allotted time. You may proceed, I will not interrupt you. The power dynamic flipped in real time. The man who had cut her off 5 times had just handed her the floor. Crockett didn't thank him, she didn't smile, she leaned forward and went straight to work. Since Shelby County, she began, voice steady and strong, states with histories of discrimination closed over 200 polling locations. Not rumors, not speculation, documented closures. She listed counties, dates, and patterns. In Texas alone, voters in minority neighborhoods were forced to travel up to 3 times farther to reach polling sites. In Georgia, ID requirements were tightened, while DMV offices in black communities were quietly shut down. She paused long enough for the numbers to sink in. That's not coincidence, that's design. The gallery sat motionless. Crockett kept building. This law doesn't punish states, it sets guardrails, it asks one simple question: does your policy protect election security without crushing access? She raised her hand slightly. Because when turnout drops 5 to 10% in targeted communities while fraud rates sit below 0.1%, that's not balance, that's selective burden. For the first time that morning, the justices leaned in instead of pushing back. Justice Barrett spoke first. Congresswoman, what safeguards exist to prevent federal overreach under this framework? Crockett answered without hesitation. Sunset clauses, performance-based exemptions, and measurable compliance standards. Jurisdictions can earn their way out. This isn't permanent oversight, it's accountability. Barrett nodded slowly, writing something down. Then Justice Kavanaugh jumped in, testing her from another angle. How do you prevent partisan misuse of these enforcement tools? Crockett met his eyes. By tying enforcement triggers to objective data, not political control. Metrics decide, not party leadership. The exchange felt electric. This wasn't scripted hostility anymore. It was real engagement. Then the room went quiet again when Justice Thomas spoke. Rarely did he enter these exchanges, and when he did, people listened. How do you reconcile this legislation with state sovereignty? He asked. Crockett didn't flinch. The Reconstruction Amendments rewrote the rules, she replied firmly. They gave Congress explicit authority to limit state power when fundamental rights are threatened. Voting isn't a local privilege, it's a constitutional guarantee. Thomas studied her for a moment and made a note on his pad. That alone sent a visible shock through the gallery. Reporters glanced at each other. Something historic was happening. Roberts waited until the room settled again before speaking. When he finally did, it wasn't an interruption. It was a direct question, measured but heavy with consequence. Representative Crockett, he said, leaning slightly forward, states argue these measures are about election integrity. They claim a sovereign responsibility to protect against fraud. How do you respond to the charge that this legislation weakens that effort? The chamber tightened instantly. Everyone knew this was the core battlefield. This wasn't about tone anymore. This was about the heart of the law. Cameras zoomed closer, reporters stopped writing, even the justices shifted in their seats, sensing the moment mattered. Crockett didn't rush her answer, she nodded once slowly. Mr. Chief Justice, election integrity is real. Nobody here is dismissing that, she said. But integrity only works if it's honest. She lifted a document from her stack. Here's the problem. In states previously covered by federal oversight, turnout among minority voters dropped between 5 and 10% after new restrictions were imposed. At the same time, those same states reported proven voter fraud rates below 0.1%. A low murmur moved through the gallery. Crockett pressed harder. So we have policies that create massive access barriers to stop a problem that barely exists. That's not security, that's imbalance. Her voice sharpened slightly. When the cure is more damaging than the disease, it stops being protection and starts becoming suppression. She stepped deeper into the argument. This bill doesn't block states from securing elections, she said firmly. It sets a standard. If a state can show that a proposed change protects integrity without disproportionately harming access, it goes through. If it can't, it pauses until that harm is fixed. She tapped the document lightly. That's not federal takeover, that's constitutional accountability. The room felt tense but focused. This wasn't emotional anymore, it was structural. Crockett leaned forward. Right now the system rewards speed over fairness. States rush changes through, communities absorb the damage, and the courts clean up years later. This law reverses that. It forces proof before harm, not apologies after. Roberts listened without interrupting. His eyes stayed locked on the pages in front of him. He flipped one sheet then another, slower this time. The irritation from earlier was gone, replaced by something more uncomfortable: concentration. His jaw tightened then relaxed. When he looked back up, his tone had changed. You're suggesting, he said carefully, that the real issue isn't whether states can regulate elections but whether they can do so without imposing unequal burdens. Crockett answered immediately, exactly. Equal rules don't mean equal impact, and when impact becomes predictable, patterned, and measurable, it stops being accidental. The words hung in the air. For a moment, Roberts didn't respond. He sat still, processing, weighing the implications. The silence felt different from before. Not hostile, not frozen, but heavy with thought. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter, slower. This court has struggled with how to balance sovereignty and protection, he admitted. Your data raises serious questions about whether that balance is being maintained. That admission sent a visible shock through the gallery. It wasn't a concession, but it was something close to it. The room didn't explode with noise after Crockett finished. It did something stranger, it froze. Reporters sat with pens hovering above notebooks, not writing, just staring. A veteran Supreme Court correspondent in the front row slowly lowered her glasses, whispering to the person beside her, I've never seen this courtroom go this quiet. Staffers along the walls avoided eye contact like they didn't want to disturb whatever had just shifted in the air. Even the court sketch artist paused mid-stroke, pencil hanging above the page. The tension wasn't hostile anymore, it was stunned. People weren't reacting because they were still trying to process what they had just witnessed. A moment where power had been questioned in the most powerful legal room in the country. Then Roberts spoke again, and this time it wasn't part of the usual script. Representative Crockett, he said, his voice steady but noticeably softer. The court will of course deliberate on the legal issues before us, but I want to acknowledge something. Heads snapped up across the chamber. Your presentation raises broader questions about how this institution hears arguments and how we ensure fairness in this room. That alone was extraordinary. He paused, choosing his words carefully. If patterns exist that undermine equal participation, they deserve reflection. He didn't apologize, he didn't surrender ground, but he did something far rarer. He publicly admitted the court itself might need to look inward, and everyone in that room understood the weight of that sentence. Within minutes of the session ending, the story detonated outside the building. Headlines rolled out in real time. Crockett confronts Chief Justice with courtroom data. Supreme Court hearing turns into power showdown. Sixth sentence stuns the bench. CNN broke into live coverage where legal analysts argued on air about whether Crockett had just changed the rules of courtroom advocacy. One panelist called it historic accountability. Another shot back, calling it a dangerous challenge to tradition. Over on Fox, the narrative flipped hard. Commentators framed it as disrespect, theatrics, and political ambush. The clash itself became part of the story, not just what happened, but how the country was reacting to it. Online, the moment turned viral in under an hour. Clips of Crockett's sixth sentence spread across platforms, racking up millions of views. Hashtags exploded. Short edits looped Roberts' frozen reaction beside Crockett's calm delivery. Some called it the courtroom mic drop. Others called it the day the bench got challenged, but no one ignored it. Memes, debates, reaction videos. The clip stopped being just a hearing moment and turned into a symbol of confrontation between institutions and accountability. Meanwhile, inside Congress, phones rang nonstop. Lawmakers who had stayed quiet on voting rights suddenly wanted meetings. A few senators who had been on the fence began floating compromise language. At the White House, advisors quietly shifted the schedule. What had been planned as a routine policy push was now being treated like a political opening. Behind closed doors at the court, the ripple went even deeper. That evening, Roberts called an unusual private meeting with the justices. According to later accounts, the room was tense. Some pushed back hard, arguing the court should never respond to public pressure. Others admitted the data raised uncomfortable questions. Voices overlapped, lines were drawn, no votes were taken, but something changed. In the weeks that followed, court watchers noticed it. Interruptions dropped, advocates were allowed to finish longer stretches of argument. Some clerks even began tracking speaking patterns internally, quietly, unofficially. It wasn't reform on paper, it was awareness in practice. After the hearing, momentum hit fast. Editorial boards backed the bill. Media pressure grew. And within weeks, the voting rights bill cleared the Senate with enough votes to avoid another stalemate. What once looked stalled suddenly moved forward, driven by the shockwave Crockett had created inside the courtroom. But the impact went beyond politics. In Georgia, elderly voters who had been turned away before shared videos of finally voting without barriers. Tribal communities in the Southwest reopened access to nearby polling locations. College students reported fewer registration obstacles. The law wasn't just passing on paper, it was changing real lives. Inside the Supreme Court, the shift was quieter but just as important. Before a later hearing, Roberts announced the court would make a deliberate effort to allow advocates to finish their arguments before interruption. It was subtle but unmistakable. The institution was adjusting. The room itself felt different, slower, more careful, more aware. When Crockett was asked about the moment that started it all, she didn't celebrate. "This was never about me," she said. "It was about evidence. It was about forcing the truth to be heard." And that became the lasting message. One sentence didn't silence a man, it forced an institution to listen. It turned a courtroom pause into a turning point and proved that sometimes data and courage together can move the course of history. If this story showed you how one moment can shift power and change history, don't let it end here. Hit subscribe to stay with us as we break down the real confrontations shaping America's future. Like this video, share it with someone who cares about truth and accountability, and leave a comment below. Do you think Crockett's move crossed a line, or did it finally force the system to listen? Turn on notifications so you never miss the next story where power gets challenged and silence gets broken.